not likely to have a winner take all AI unipolarity. You're much more likely to have some form of AI bipolarity, where the US is good in some things, frontier AI as a service, and China is good at other things.
If one of the United States' great advantages is compute, how much does stability and predictability in American export controls matter?
I teach at Stanford University. We have, I think, some of the smartest students in the world. I think that's fair. They're super great at at various STEM fields, and a lot of them are really nervous that they're not going to get jobs.
I'm thrilled to be speaking with my guest today, Professor Colin Kahl of Stanford University, who directs the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford and was formerly the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at DoD during the Biden administration. Not only is Colin an incredibly accomplished academic and an extraordinary policymaker, but he was one of the first people who welcomed me to Washington as I was finishing up my own dissertation, because our shared advisor at Columbia University, where we both did our doctoral studies, connected us. I'm excited to talk to him both about a new article that he's written on the future of the artificial intelligence race and to get the latest on the state of play in Iran. Let's give a listen. Colin Kahl, thanks so much for being with us. It's great to see you.
Great to see you too.
I've been really excited to talk to you today because you've just published a great piece in Foreign Affairs. I really loved this article, The Myth of the AI Race, because it debunks what I've seen as a fairly straw-mannish argument that we often see made in policy circles. And that's the idea that the United States and China are locked in this linear race towards AGI, artificial general intelligence. And when one of them crosses that finish line, the whole world is going to transform and they will collect all the benefits. You lay out in this piece a really important argument that demonstrates that this is a multi-dimensional, non-linear competition in which each one of these powers are going to have advantages in different places that will accrue in different ways over the coming years. I'd love you to just start by unpacking this argument for us.
Sure. Well, it's great to be with you, Mira. It's always good to have a conversation with such a great friend and former colleague. Look, the piece basically argues that we are not trending towards a kind of unipolar AI world in which it's a winner take all, either the US or China crosses some magical finish line and that's it, like game, set, and match. I do believe that the United States has some profound advantages. The best models continue to be produced by American companies. OpenAI, Anthropic, Google lead the pack. But frankly, their edge is probably now measured in months, not years. And the Chinese firms have proved to be fast followers. So obviously, DeepSeek has gotten a lot of attention, but Alibaba, Moonshot. There's a number of Chinese labs that are extraordinarily good and are producing very good models that are proving to be fast followers at the frontier. And I think there are just other areas where China has potential advantages. One is that in the race for AI diffusion around the globe and kind of whose technology stack dominates AI ecosystems, China has certain advantages in the ability to build out infrastructure that is good enough for a lot of customers, that has state support from Beijing, and may serve markets that U.S. companies might not be inclined to serve. And that really the only limit there is on China's access to sufficient amounts of compute, good enough chips. And we can come back to that conversation. And then the other area where China, has real advantages, I think, is in the embodiment of AI in robots, industrial robots for factories, humanoid robots down the line. And that'll have real implications for the ability to kind of transform bits into atoms, that is, to actually translate the gains of intelligence into physical things. And there, I just think China is really poised potentially to eat America's lunch. So you're not likely to have a winner-take-all AI unipolarity. You're much more likely to have some form of AI bipolarity, where the US is good in some things, AI, frontier AI as a service, and China is good at other things, good enough AI infrastructure and embodied AI.
That makes a whole lot of sense to me, and really builds upon some trends we've seen in the past, right? Like other plays at heart in digital infrastructure that the PRC has made through the Belt and Road Initiative, which for all the U.S. ability to try has had huge success in the global South without a whole lot of competition from us. But I want to come back to that point when we talk about strategy for what comes next. You just raised, however, the issue that I really wanted to dig into is the question of advantages in compute. On kind of a linear trend trajectory, you suggested that these relative advantages might lead to kind of a lumpy bipolarity in AI 3 years or so down the line. But if one of the United States' great advantages is compute, how much does stability and predictability in American export controls matter? And in particular, how much does and will it matter that the Trump administration has proven willing in just the last few months to make some major compromises, like allowing Nvidia to sell the H200 into PRC markets? What should we think about that doing to America's relative advantage?
Yeah, so I think it's important for listeners to understand that in most respects, China has everything they need to compete with the United States at the frontier of AI. They have a ton of talent. They have brilliant engineers and coders. They have all the data they need. And they're really good at building infrastructure. And they have a lot of electricity to power that infrastructure. And so they have basically everything they need except leading edge compute, both in terms of quantity and quality. The best chips are designed by American companies, Nvidia, AMD, and are mostly produced by TSMC on Taiwan. China has been trying for years to indigenize leading edge chip production. Huawei in particular is trying to catch up with Nvidia. But the best chips that Huawei produces, the Ascend 910 series, are basically 60 or 70% as good as the chips that Nvidia was producing back in 2022. So they're lagging, and it's not just in quality, but in quantity. Whereas Nvidia is pumping out millions of chips a year, Huawei struggles to produce hundreds of thousands of these lesser chips. And a big part of the reason for that are export controls. So, starting in the first Trump administration, the United States worked with allies like Japan and the Netherlands and South Korea to restrict semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Particularly important was access to the Dutch company ASML's advanced lithography equipment, extreme ultraviolet lithography, which is essential equipment. It's like the most complex machinery in the world. But essentially, without EUV technology, you can't produce sub 7 nanometer chips to fill up your AI data centers. And so this has really made it hard for China to indigenize leading edge chips. There have also been export controls, obviously, on the sale of leading edge chips to China. That was dialed up considerably under the Biden administration, as well as restrictions on the high bandwidth memory, which are necessary to produce leading edge chips. So there are a lot of constraints until recently on China's ability to indigenously produce chips at the edge. So either they have to solve that problem, which they are not on the verge of doing, or they need to get access to good enough chips from the United States. And this is actually where the H200 decision that Trump made back in December is so consequential. The H200 is not NVIDIA's best chips, right? NVIDIA is selling Blackwell chips that are considerably more performant than the H200. They are in the midst of creating these Rubin chips, which will be even more performant than the Blackwell. So in giving H200s, we're not giving the best of the best. But we are providing China with really good chips. Most AI data centers, most of the models that we think of were trained in data centers that run H100 or H200 chips. These are really good chips. And, since Trump's announcement in December, I think Chinese companies have put in orders for something like 2 million Nvidia chips. There's a lot of concern on Capitol Hill and among some analyst groups that this will really allow China to close the compute gap with good enough chips. Yeah, they'll have to pay more and the chips won't be quite as good, but they're a lot better than they can produce indigenously. And I think NVIDIA's argument that I think the Trump administration ultimately was persuaded by is that by selling NVIDIA chips, you will essentially crowd out the demand for Huawei chips. And so you'll be able to strangle Huawei in the crib, and all that revenue will flow back to American companies that we can then recycle into research and development to stay at the edge. And oh, by the way, we'll make China dependent on our chips and the software that wraps around those data centers, and that type of entanglement will favor the United States. The problem is, I don't think Beijing is going to play ball on that. The authorities in China have basically said they're going to modulate how many Nvidia chips come in to make sure there's sufficient domestic demand for Huawei. And we know that Huawei can't produce millions of chips. So you're not going to drive down the demand for Huawei chips. You're only going to increase the supply of total compute available to China. And let me make one last point. Folks like David Sachs, who's the White House czar for crypto and AI, have made the argument that the U.S. wins the global AI race if the majority of the world is running on a U.S. AI stack, right? American data centers filled with American design chips running American models, right? I think he's not wrong about that. But if you allow Chinese companies to get access to good enough Nvidia chips, you are likely to have Chinese-built data centers, not just in China, but across the world, with American designed chips running Chinese models. That is not an American stack. That is a US-enabled Chinese stack. And that's one of the things I'm very worried about.
I couldn't agree more, Colin. To your point about the Chinese showing no signs about becoming dependent on American technology, I think we've seen going back to 2022 when we served together in the Biden administration that Xi Jinping has taken a very clear decision that China won't be dependent on any other country for its high technology needs. So this is a matter of kind of closing the gap and shoring up China's indigenously produced capabilities. And as you also say, even since the Trump administration announced the H200 decision, we see Chinese authorities putting in place all sorts of early measures that are designed to mediate the flow of the H200 into the China market so that the Chinese government essentially has control over when and where these chips land and who has access to them. But the folks who need them most will absolutely get them under that model. I want to kind of dive down a little bit more into some of China's areas of advantage. And in particular, you make a great case that the PRC is seeing significant productivity gains, in part from really strong ability to adopt AI technologies through things like AI robots that have contributed to radical gains in productivity in factories. I don't know if we have studies you would know perhaps that measure or compare American rates of AI adoption and gains in productivity. But I do know that there have been a number of persuasive analyses recently that suggest that perhaps American gains in AI-powered productivity are lagging at least a bit where economists might have expected us to be 2 or 3 years ago. Looking ahead to a potential world of 2029, where there could be a change in leadership in the American government, does the United States need to think about some kind of domestic strategy that would supercharge its adoption of AI for productive uses as the Chinese appear to be mastering? We'll go into sort of the next phase of an international AI strategy in just a minute, but stipulating that strategy would need a whole bunch of guardrails to really guard against some of the very real consequences that will come from those productivity gains. Does the United States need to be doing more on a government basis, and how would that change the way that we work with industry?
Yeah, it's a big question, and when I the caveat that I'm a political scientist who focuses on international relations, so I'm not a political economist, and I don't I'm not an expert on American industrial policy. I'm a hobbyist, not an expert. But I'll say a few things. I think we're going to have a real test in 2026. There's a lot of talk about, is there an AI bubble? Are these companies that are making, trillions of dollars in investments, are they ever going to recoup those investments? And a lot of that depends on, how many American companies and companies around the world adopt these tools within their enterprises to achieve productivity gains, right? That is to basically make their operations more efficient. And in part, that will happen by displacing the need to hire people and replacing them with cheaper access to models who can do what those people do, especially entry-level positions, but also to leverage the growing capabilities of these models to design new products and in general, be more profitable for businesses. That's really about enterprise adoption here in the United States and around the world. And this is a place where I think American companies, thus far have an edge over their Chinese counterparts. Although there is some attractiveness to the fact that a lot of the leading edge Chinese models are open weight or open source, so they're more freely available and can be more easily fine tuned for use within particular enterprises in particular places. But I think we're gonna find out in 2026 whether enterprises really dial up their adoption of AI to essentially replace the human intelligence of their workers or augment the human intelligence of their workers. That's separate, though, from the Chinese approach, which is to do those things too, but also to translate AI into building smarter and smarter machines that are capable of turning out more electric vehicles and more batteries and more electronics of all kinds. And I think what you're really likely to see is in a way AI kind of supercharging what we already see, which is that the United States dominates globally in terms of services, and China dominates globally in terms of industrial production and overcapacity. And AI might dial that up on the American side, on the services side, and dial it up on the industrial capacity side in China. I mean, we've a lot of your listeners will have already seen, segments on news programs about so-called dark factories in China. These are factories that have very few humans in them. They're called dark because they don't need the lights on, because the robots don't need lights, and they're pumping out smartphones and cars and the like. And so that raises the question of 2029. I actually believe this is going to be an issue in the midterms too, largely framed in terms of affordability and linked to things like electricity prices and concerns about job loss. But certainly when we look ahead at 2029, the major adaptation that I think that we have to do, and I hope we don't wait till 2029, by the way, is to get our workforce ready for these transitions, because you're going to have two types of pressure, right? The pressure from AI as a service is going to put pressure on white collar jobs, especially entry-level white-collar jobs. I teach at Stanford University. We have, I think, some of the smartest students in the world. I think that's fair. They're super great at at various STEM fields, and a lot of them are really nervous that they're not going to get jobs. They're not going to get jobs as entry-level engineers and coders. They're not going to get jobs at places like McKinsey because why hire 30 people fresh out of undergrads when you can hire 3 and they can be super empowered by models that can code at least as well as humans can, or pump out market analysis or legal analysis or you name it. So I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure on white collar jobs, especially entry level jobs, and that means we have to think about how we are training and educating the American people so that they can partner with machines. And be augmented by them as opposed to being replaced by them. I have a 14-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son, and one of the things that I think is probably true about their future is that for the rest of their lives they're never going to be smarter than AI. But they don't need to be smarter than AI. They just need a scenario in which my daughter plus AI is smarter than AI alone. But that's going to require us as a society to completely retool how we educate and train workers. So that's one thing. The other shock that's coming is for blue collar workers, and I think it's less about the pace of embodiment of AI in industrial practices here in the United States, and it's more that AI is going to supercharge the pressure that American workers are already facing from the juggernaut that is China's industrial capacity. So we also have to figure out, how are we updating our labor laws? How are we training our factory workers to partner with machines so that we can be more efficient? How do we think about sensible trade protections from Chinese overcapacity? How do we work with our allies, if we still have allies in 2029 on those issues? So that's what I think the agenda is broadly about.
Fantastic. I think you've made a really great case that we should think about AI in many ways supercharging the United States and China's existing strengths, and also supercharging the existing pressures on our workforce. And that's a huge agenda for any candidate and group of smart policymakers to figure out. But I want to stick to sort of the question of the future of AI policy and take it international for a minute. Of course, big open question if we'll have any allies and partners, as you say, and in particular, what the United States will be seeking to achieve and prevent on the global stage a few years from now. But in this great piece, you lay out a competitive international strategy for the United States in which you recommend that Washington really doubles down on its advantages. Basically keeping export controls in place wherever we can to protect our highest end technologies and our compute advantages, and then doubling down on agencies like the Development Finance Corporation and the Export-Import Bank that could really seed American AI and related development and production overseas, and in particular in areas like the Global South, where we often find ourselves handicapped to extend our reach in ways that are properly competitive with the PRC. What do we need to do to actually implement a strategy like this? And I ask this not because I don't think it's the right thing. I think it's absolutely the right thing. But again, you and I have worked together in instances in which we wanted to catch the PRC in the 5G race. And we wanted to rely on those same tools of government to be able to work with our private sector to get higher standards, more secure solutions into the hands of our partners in the Global South. And we did not keep pace, largely. So what needs to be different this time? And in particular, any recommendations for how we want government to create incentives that will really get businesses to move into these areas?
Yeah. So the first thing is, I'm on the record as supporting us to continue to enforce export controls. If the Trump administration doesn't reverse itself on the H200, there's no evidence that it will. I hope it resists the urge to sell Blackwell chips to, or some version of Blackwell chips to China. There's a lot of conversation in Congress about whether Congress will legislate export controls that slow down China's access to good enough American-designed chips. I would be supportive of those efforts. A lot of this, though, is going to require us to continue to work with our allies, because in a world where China, is able to get access to pretty good American chips, and the question is, what effect does this have on indigenization of their own capacity? Does it slow it down? Does it speed it up? And there, we really need to continue to enforce our export controls on semiconductor manufacturing equipment and tools. And for that, we're going to have to cooperate with the Netherlands and Japan and South Korea and other countries. But on the diffusion side, the Trump administration, I think, is smartly committed to trying to kind of bundle and vertically integrate a US AI stack, right? That is to provide an offering, not unlike China does, right? Where China comes in and they provide the whole thing. They'll build the data center. They'll build the roads to the data center. They'll build the power plant that powers the data center. They'll fill the data center with chips. They'll supply the models to run in those data centers, like the whole package. So what is the American version of that? And I think the Trump administration is mindful that we need to be able to bundle together a kind of vertically integrated offering. That's great. That is completely the right idea. The problem is, even if you can get companies to kind of agree to cooperate together to offer this bundled offering, there are lots of parts of the globe that if you just unleash market forces, the market's not going to serve, right? Like the market is going to serve big countries in the global south like India or Indonesia, or hubs like UAE or Malaysia or Kenya. Like I believe the market will flow into those areas, but that leaves huge swaths of the global south where you don't have enough people, you don't have enough customers, you don't have enough basic infrastructure. And that is fertile terrain for China to basically fill the gap, because China's not going to think of this in terms of market logic. They're going to think of this in terms of geopolitical and geostrategic logic, and they will subsidize their companies to make investments in places that the United States won't. So how do we compete with that? And in my mind, obviously the Trump administration has dismantled a number of our development tools, but I still think they have an opportunity to dial up the tools that we have left, especially the Development Finance Corporation, DFC, and Exim Bank, and here they really need to work with Congress, because the administration can't do it by itself. We wanted to work with Congress and the Biden administration too, and we just weren't able to get Congress to implement a number of reforms. So what would the reforms actually mean? I think it would mean working with Congress to raise DFC's overall investment cap, just so there's more money that can be made in these investments. But more importantly, the Congress really needs to change how DFC equity investments are scored, so that they are scored based on anticipated gains and losses, not treating the equity as a cost. Just as a cost that comes off the balance sheet. That in and of itself would free up a lot of the money that exists now to make more investments. I think it's also important that DFC is allowed to invest in higher income digital hubs that can serve lower income neighboring countries. I think there's a lot of support for doing that. I think on the Exim Bank side, I think the rules need to be updated so that things like software, cloud services, cybersecurity, and AI services are treated as exports, not just physical equipment. And I think that we need to find ways for DFC and Exim Bank to work more collaboratively together, where Exim kind of is used to help finance U.S. technology exports, while DFC helps de-risk those investments. And I think there's a lot of bipartisan support that for this. And I think if the Trump administration leaned in on these issues, and I hope that they will on Capitol Hill, that you could get a bipartisan agreement on some reforms that would unlock a lot of this.
I think these are great recommendations. And Colin, you're, of course, absolutely right that this is a space that the PRC is going to move into with alacrity, whether or not we move. I think one thing that will be different this time, though, which is all the more reason that, policymakers on both sides of the aisle should take your recommendations, is that many countries in the global south who are underserved and where there aren't market incentives to move in have already had the experience of working very closely with China's Belt and Road. And in many cases, including on digital products, the PRC has come up short. If you ask a country like Cambodia, the country is littered with unfinished Chinese-backed projects that did not ultimately benefit the Cambodian economy. So that's all the more reason why there should be an alternative that could actually do better this time.
100%.
But of course, it's going to take the wisdom to recognize your recommendation.
And it doesn't have to be the Cadillac offering. By the way, I think our companies don't have to offer the very best of the best. They need to compete with China on good enough infrastructure for a lot of these places. And I think they need to make offers. I think our leading companies are aware of this, that our hyperscalers are aware of this. But they need to offer opportunities that don't just benefit American companies, but also benefit local ecosystems, like helping to train local workforces, helping to support local AI developers, partnering with regional and local firms to strengthen their capacity, and then emphasize that the U.S. offering is not just technologically superior or at least as good as whatever China can offer, but that it's got better cybersecurity, that it's got better transparency, that it's more respecting of privacy and data sovereignty. Like, we have to basically argue that the US version of it competes with China on these kind of quality metrics, not just how good it is, but also integrity metrics of how reliable and trustworthy it is relative to, China vacuuming up all the data and sending it back to Beijing for God knows what reason.
Certainly in Asia, I think the recommendations you just shared, Colin, both about American companies partnering in joint ventures with local companies and training local workers are likely to be huge sells for local economies. So again, hope folks will listen to this wisdom. Many of our listeners will know Colin from his most recent position in government as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and as a superb academic. But anyone who really knows his CV will know that he got his start at DoD as a Middle East expert. So while we've been talking AI, I would be remiss if I did not ask him at least one question about the Middle East and in particular Iran. So Colin, if you'll permit me just one more, I'd like to make a quick pivot. The world has been very focused of late on Greenland and on Europe, but lest we forget, just the week before, we saw unprecedented protests seizing Iran, as well as talk of the possibility that the United States would potentially, at some point, launch some kind of additional military action that was intended to undermine the regime. And of course, rumors as well that Israel could consider doing the same. Obviously, it seems that the protests have died down from their height, although information is still very spotty. And yet, 10 days ago, we were talking about the possibility that this activity could be the beginning of the end for the regime in Iran. So, what should we be watching in the coming days now that there's an American carrier in the region? Do we think there is a possibility of some military action? And indeed, have we begun to see the beginning of the end of something in Iran, even if we don't quite know what that looks like?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, the eyes of the world in the last few days have been focused on Davos, where the public conversation was mostly about European security and Greenland and a little bit of Ukraine, but there were a lot of side conversations on Iran, right? I mean, even when Zelensky addressed Davos, for example, a meaningful part of his speech talked about Iran. So I think that this is a story that's likely to come roaring back for the reasons that you mentioned. As you said, at the height of the protests and the violent crackdown against protesters 10 days ago, it looked like Trump was on the verge of authorizing strikes. Trump, for better or worse, had put this red line down saying that he would authorize military action against the regime if they started killing a bunch of people. And they did start killing a bunch of people. It's hard to know how many, but it's certainly in the thousands. It could be many thousands. But Trump appeared to back away from a strike at the last minute, I think for two reasons. One, I think he was convinced by the Pentagon that in Pentagon speak, the theater wasn't set. In other words, we didn't have the assets in the region to conduct the types of operations that the United States conducted last summer in the context of the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. And the reason for that is obvious. All those assets were in the Caribbean supporting operations against Venezuela and the drug boats and all the other story before Greenland that everybody was fixated on. So you had to move assets into theater. And in the last 10 days, we've seen those assets move. You mentioned an aircraft carrier that was shifted from the Indo-Pacific, much to the chagrin, I'm sure, of our Asian partners, over to the Middle East. We've seen this movie before, a huge sucking sound of Middle East instability drawing assets away from Asia. It's an aircraft carrier is not just an aircraft carrier. It comes with cruisers and destroyers that have air defense assets. There are submarines that guard the carrier. There's a lot of strike power and defensive power in a carrier strike group. People have also noted that another carrier has actually been deployed to Europe, which means it could easily be shifted into the Mediterranean to support the defense of Israel, which is what we did last summer, or it could be moved through the Suez Canal to enter the Red Sea and join the other carrier in the Middle East region. So we actually have two carriers in the region. My understanding is we've also surged a number of air defense assets into the region and tankers and other things. So the theater is now set, whereas it wasn't set before. But the other reason I think Trump basically decided not to do it 10 days ago is that the Iranian regime gave him a way out by not publicly executing protesters. And so that allowed Trump to kind of declare victory. So we're in this kind of odd moment where the time to strike was probably 10 days ago, if you're Trump, but he didn't have the assets in play. But now we have the assets in play, but it's not clear what the trigger would be. So I think what your listeners should be on the lookout for is whether the information space starts to be dialed up in terms of the Iranian threat, right? Either residual threats to protesters or other threats that are concerning to the United States and Israel, to include any efforts by Iran to restart their nuclear program, but especially, I think, from Israel's perspective, Iran's effort to reconstitute their ballistic missile arsenal. And so I think if you start to see that in the information space, that could be a signal that they are laying the predicate for actually carrying out its strikes. Now, what those strikes would do, what effect they would have, nobody knows. I mean, you could target IRGC installations and command and control. The Israelis did a lot of that last summer. The United States could certainly do some of that now. That in and of itself is not likely to crack the regime, if that is the goal. You could target missile fields and other things. So you could do something demonstratively that and maybe meaningfully weaken some of the capabilities of the regime. But one of the things that this regime has displayed over and over again is that they have extraordinary repressive power. And one of the reasons why you haven't seen a revolution yet is, the opposition is divided. They don't have a clear focal point. But the main reason is that the regime is united, and that the security forces have not defected from the regime. And I don't see attacks on the security forces from outside doing anything to shatter that cohesion. In fact, in the near term, it might actually contribute to glue that keeps the security forces together against a common external foe. So it's not clear what the trigger of the strikes would be, and it's not clear what the strikes would be and what intended effect they would be they would cause. But in the Trump era, anything's possible.
Anything's possible. A perfect place to leave it. The inimitable Professor Colin Kahl, a treat to talk to you as always.
Thanks, Mira. Great to see you.
As I digest my conversation with Colin, I'm struck how much the trends that we talked about with respect to artificial intelligence really involve the amplification of strengths and weaknesses that each of the US and China already faced, as opposed to a total revolution in the way that each plays on the world stage. While the adoption of AI will place undoubtable challenges on the United States when it comes to the way that it utilizes its workforce and the way it diffuses technology abroad, U.S. strengths continue to be in areas related to services and superpowered by our edge in compute. The Chinese, by contrast, are showing a real edge in their ability to adopt AI productively and to begin exporting good enough technology around the world. This will not only encumber policymakers to come up with really thoughtful approaches to help the United States compete on the global stage, but require them to work more closely than ever with businesses to make sure that they do it effectively. Today's episode was produced by Refund Dewey Astino and executive produced by Lauren Dewick, with editorial input from Prashant Jha. It contains music by Cody Martin via Soundstripe. What Comes Next is a production of the Asia Group and is powered by Tag AI, Tag's geopolitical decision engine for business. We'll see you on the next episode.